Welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us for this special webinar brought to you by the Open University Business School as part of Learning at Work Week. My name is Sue Hughes and I'm a Senior Lecturer in Executive Education in the OU Business School. I'm delighted to be hosting today's session and equally delighted to be joined by my colleagues Joe Lambert and Liz Moody, and they'll be introducing themselves shortly. Over the next 30 minutes, we want to share with you some of our perspectives and thoughts on the case for curiosity. We hope you find it interesting and thought-provoking. The webinar we're hosting today forms part of a wider set of activity taking place during Learning at Work Week. This initiative is coordinated by the Campaign for Learning and is an annual opportunity to celebrate and promote the benefits of workplace learning. All sorts of organisations are running activities this week, so thank you for taking the time to join us here in this forum. Just a bit of basic housekeeping. You'll be able to interact with us during this webinar in a number of ways. You'll see on your screen a chat panel, and we invite you to share your questions there. We'll try and answer as many of those as we can. You'll also have the chance to participate in our polls, and we'll be handing over to our technical manager, Olivia, to launch those during the course of the next 30 minutes. Just a reminder that this webinar will be recorded and available online after this session. So if you have any colleagues who would like to have joined in, you can share this with them. Okay, let's hand you over to Liz Moody to get us started.
Good afternoon. In this webinar, we want to explore with you the power of curiosity, a concept that we often clearly see in children's development, but in this context also has extraordinary benefits for adults.
So a quick look at the agenda for today. We're starting with a quick poll about interest and workplace learning and why we, in our roles as learning providers, are particularly interested in the role of curiosity has. We then get into the interesting bit, what is curiosity and why is it different than just having an interest in something. Then we look at what curiosity does for learning. What does it mean in today's world, today's workplace and the challenges faced. And finally, what can you do to improve learning? How do you encourage your L&D department to exploit curiosity more? And some tools that you can take away.
And first, a question. This is our first poll. Do you think that being personally interested in the subject matter makes a difference to how much you get out of your learning experiences at work? A box will pop up in the screen in which you can cast your vote. And while the results are coming in, a bit more background as to why Liz and Joe are interested in this subject.
Joe, I think it's fair to say that we see ourselves as curious learners, and so I don't know about you, but I almost feel it's our duty to sort of promote and provoke curiosity in the learning that we develop for our clients. So we tend to look at it from the adult perspective, but we learn a lot from understanding child development and how much they learn in their early stages, almost without limits at times. Personally, in my role of designing and developing work-based learning for leaders and managers, the outcome of the learning should really provide benefits for them in their careers, but also their staff and the organisations that they work for, and ultimately, of course, their customers. So I'm very conscious of my own response to learning, and it's something that I recognise as being, if it's something that I'm learning about that I recognise as helpful to me in my work, I can see the benefit learning these things, but there's a different dynamic when you're learning things that are out of genuine curiosity. So inevitably, I think curiosity makes me more proactive, makes me more inclined to learn and pursue newer themes and topics, and these in turn also tend to lead me into what I consider to be more interesting things often. I think there's a different motivation with curiosity. I think the energy that's involved in learning when you're curious about something makes it something, it's not a chore to learn when you're genuinely curious about things, because you don't really know where it's going to lead you. So there's something quite exciting about that. So I think my own personal experience of using curiosity as a motivation led me to think whether or not it's possible to harness that to get more innovation, creativity, maybe a bit more diversity in thinking, and therefore more inquiring and active minds amongst the learners that we work with. And I think these are the kinds of people that certainly I want to be managing our institutions. I want our service providers to be curious and taking decisions that affect our lives and our choices and our life chances. I want them to be curious about things. I want them to be exploring more rather than just accepting that what they're told is all there is to know. What about you?
Yeah, very similar experience in that, I've been involved in learning design for about 17 years, and this has primarily been in the online environment where the challenge is how to make learning engaging when there is that distance between what is traditionally thought of teacher and the learner. And like you, Liz, I've realised from a very personal experience when I was studying for a qualification that was outside my own discipline of management, and I required it for professional development though, is that the learning was not as enjoyable, I wasn't as motivated, I perhaps did not get as much out of it as I should have or could have done, and so that for me was a real insight into how people have to learn in management, in the workplace, but actually perhaps don't really have an interest in being a better manager. So for me, in designing management learning for others, it's about how can I invoke and provoke that curiosity, that interest in learning that makes it sustainable.
I think we've now got the results of the first poll in. So Liz, do you want to have a look at the results? I think we have 99 people voting for and saying yes, and just one saying no.
Well, that's pretty much as we expected, but it could have gone two ways. I think it'd be interesting to hear from the 1% that said it doesn't make any difference to them whether they're personally interested in learning or not. But I mean, no matter what you said, actually there's some quite interesting issues that come out of the poll. One, when you think about whether interest has to be involved in it, we'll pick up later about who's responsible for your learning and how learning experiences, so we will come to that later. Another one we might want to go into more now, though, is how we regard learning at work, because possibly when people were looking at the poll, they immediately assumed that we were talking about formal learning and training courses that they either have to attend or they seek to attend. But learning isn't only about what we do in the formal setting. There's a lot more that we gain and learn in the workplace from informal settings like speaking to colleagues, watching what they do, asking questions of them, or coming up with solutions for customers to generate new ideas. These are all learning experiences and not ones that we have to wait until the next training course to do. So that's quite an interesting finding in itself. And some of these issues I think we're going to touch on later.
As we mentioned earlier, we draw a lot on children and childhood behaviour, where children are naturally curious. You explore, you ask questions. How does this work? Why? Why? But why? Why? We try things out, we learn because we need to. We need to survive and we need to become independent beings. In the modern workplace, standing still with your skills and knowledge is not a great strategy for success. The amount of change, how quickly we have to change, and how we have to adapt how we work is accelerating with the use of technology, with competition for jobs. All of these things mean that those who understand how to compete and build the skills and knowledge necessary will have a great chance of surviving and thriving. Building skills and knowledge is what learning is all about. Knowing or recognising there are things that you don't know, that you have a knowledge gap. The fundamental motivation for adult learning, which brings us to being curious. Let's find out a little bit more what the research tells us in this next short video. Can you please play it, Olivia? And while we are listening to that, you can, of course, post questions in the chat facility.
Curiosity has been described in different ways in academic literature. Some writers describe it as a state of mind or something that varies by situation. Others see it as a personality trait that is a fixed feature regardless of the context. While it's quite interesting to classify it in this way, our research and interest is as people who create work-based learning programs and how curiosity can be harnessed in practical ways to good effect in the context of adult work-based learning. The relationship of curiosity to learning is not new. It has its roots in philosophy and behavioural psychology, motivation theory, and more recently in neuroscience, and importantly the cognitive constructivist theory of learning, which is attributed to psychologist Jean Piaget. This theory says that people can't simply be given information, but instead they construct their own learning by building on their knowledge through their experiences. Curiosity has been shown in behavioural science experiments to fuel active learning behaviours like asking questions, exploration, researching answers, seeking solutions, and trial behaviour, or in other words, try something, see what happens, and learn from it. In the 1950s, David Berlin made a theoretical distinction between perceptual curiosity, which describes the situations where there is a stimulus that attracts attention, maybe something that is a bit out of the ordinary, and epistemic curiosity, which describes the kind of human behaviour associated with a desire to know more. This second type, epistemic curiosity, is what we might think of as a knowledge gap. One way to think of this is in relation to learning and our motivation to learn. Imagine you're reading a whodunit novel. What happens once you find out who the perpetrator is? Do you lose interest in the book, or do you read on? Is curiosity something that motivates us to embark on a learning journey, and do we need to be kept interested to go on, or is curiosity something that will lead us to keep wanting to add to our knowledge? However we think of curiosity as dependent upon our personal interests or a trait, something we have and others don't, then arguably the more important question is how and why it is useful in learning. One more recent and developing explanation for why curiosity may have an important role in learning can be found in neuroscience. Being curious seems to have a number of positive influences on learning. It can make the brain more receptive to learning, as well as making learning a more rewarding experience for the learner. It can also make learning more memorable. Using brain imaging techniques, Gruber and colleagues revealed that brain activity was enhanced during states of intrigue and curiosity, utilising the same reward circuits that are heavily involved in tangible extrinsic motivation. Their research suggested that this demonstrates a link between curiosity when learning and a feel-good factor, the positive emotions that happen when the neurotransmitter dopamine is released in the brain.
So in the video, we just heard a possible explanation for why it is we seem to get more out of learning that is the result of curiosity. Not only can we see a justification for it, but it gives us a sense of satisfaction. Not only that, some research also suggests that when people are curious, then as they begin to close an information gap through learning, this in turn increases their curiosity, so there's a virtuous effect. Conversely, if learners are not curious, if they don't acknowledge that they need to know more about something, then they don't seek to know more. This brings us to our next poll. When it comes to learning at work, which of these sources of information do you tend to trust and rely most upon to achieve your learning goals? You can select up to 3 responses, and again, a voting box will come up on your screen.
And while we wait for the poll data to come in, the volume of data and sources of information available is far greater and much more accessible to us now than it has ever been. So in theory, it is much easier for us to learn and to learn whenever we want. Does this explosion of sources of information mean that we are better off in terms of researching and learning or not? I'm still waiting for the poll results to come in, I believe. I hope you're not having any more technical issues. Results are coming in. So, we are bombarded with sources of data and information. A lot more than when I was at school, and possibly the same for most of you. So perhaps it's about quality, not quantity. We construct our own learning from our own experiences, so it's a question of sorting out what is useful from less useful, what is current from less current, what is truth from non-truth or alternative facts. We can see from reporting of current affairs, politics, public information on health advice that it is difficult to know who or what to believe. Unfortunately, not everyone's agenda is designed to present us with the facts to support our learning and our judgments. And in fact, some cases of manipulation of the facts is deliberate, and the use of algorithms enables this. And now we have our poll results in, so we'll publish those on screen for you. Very interestingly, a lot of you rely on the internet, these sources of information that we've just been talking about, this lot of information. Excellent. So you do tend to rely a lot on the internet and sources that are published. Okay. The next video looks at the relationship between data and information and learning. So if we could have the next video, this will look at the relationship between data and information.
Our fundamental premise is that curiosity and learning are a required skill for work-based learning in the 21st century. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Yeah. Well, if we think about curiosity and go back to our first introduction to it, what we found in our research was that curiosity is responsible for very positive learning behaviours. Mm-hmm. So learning behaviours like trial behaviour, researching, looking for solutions, trying to come up with creative solutions mm-hmm. for problems. And all of those things are really, really essential in a working environment where we have to be adapting now to lots of change. Mm-hmm. But another way that I think curiosity has been shown to be really useful is that in some ways it provides the kind of behaviours where we question mm-hmm. information and data that we have. We don't just accept it. So in the workplace, for example, we might get a lot of advice and information from colleagues, from bosses, from bombarded with it on the internet if we're looking mm-hmm. for information. And we need some way to sort through that. And curiosity has been shown to be very useful because it's the kind of behaviours, the questioning skills, what is this information, what is its source, who's providing the mm-hmm. information, do they have a particular angle or mm-hmm. an agenda in mind for presenting mm-hmm. that information in a certain way. All of these things are useful ways of us sorting through the morass of data and information that we have to work mm-hmm. with.
So how does data and information relate to learning?
Well, in my mind there's a hierarchy which at the bottom of that you have data, all of the facts, the discrete facts, pieces of individual data that aren't very useful in themselves. Mm-hmm. But when you put those together and there's a relationship between different parts of data, so you know my name, you know my address, you know my date of birth, as a customer of the organisation, that together provides you with information. Okay. And if you think about it in the workplace, we have information from many different sources to help us to try and take decisions, to try and decide what we need to do in our work of information. So data and information is useful, but it's learning that gives a context for that data and information. So when you have data and information and you have a context for it, you then start to have knowledge. And knowledge is what is the useful skill in learning in the workplace, because you can then build knowledge and understanding, knowledge and skills, and that eventually gives us at the very top of that hierarchy this kind of wisdom. So that creates the kind of employees that are capable, knowledgeable, and able to take good decisions in the workplace. So I see that as being primarily the relationship between all of this data and learning.
So how then does curiosity help us in work-based learning?
Well, that almost takes us right back to where we started, because curiosity is responsible for some really positive learning behaviours. So in this world of post-truths, facts and non-facts, how do we make the distinction between information that's valid, relevant, from a reliable source, up to date, All of these things that will keep us current and allow us to survive in this changing workplace. The learning behaviours that we're looking for are people who question things, and that's what curiosity does. If you remember, we spoke about the learning behaviours of people sort of evaluating, researching, testing knowledge, observing, looking for feedback. All of these things are the hallmarks of curious behaviour.
If curiosity is a good thing in the workplace, what can we do to encourage it?
Well, I think there's probably a few things. I mean, if I look at it from the point of view of a learning development strategy, learning development manager, then I think that the way that we promote learning, it could be done more creatively, so that we could actually encourage people to understand that they have a knowledge gap, and therefore encourage them to fulfill that knowledge gap. But if you think of like the soap operas, when they get to the end of one piece of learning, there could be the sort of the boom, 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 boom moment from the next training course. So the cliffhanger, or just more seriously, just the suggestion that there's more to learn, and just to encourage people that it's not a compliance thing. You learn it, it's done, it's over for another year. So I think that would be one thing that we could do, just to promote this idea that there's more to learn.
Feedback is very important in terms of learning and ensuring that the context in which you're applying any new knowledge is appropriate and being applied correctly. I also think that the freedom to explore beyond your own learning sphere is very important into areas of interest, because businesses have shown that where they draw on disciplines that are seemingly completely unrelated to their area of business make substantial improvements in business practice. For example, Velcro was invented because they looked at how pollen stuck to the back of a honeybee. And it's that kind of leap in innovation. And I know we're not talking about that kind of leap each and every time, but drawing on different disciplines does give a different dimension to the learning and the knowledge.
So for learning and development departments, that might mean that a sort of broader kind of curriculum, and accepting that the learning doesn't have to be in a very fixed, we do this to have that, to recognise that that there's a learning effect from people being able to develop their interests in other areas, and it might have it might translate into another area of their work. But more importantly, I think it helps to gather momentum behind the learners to keep on learning too, so it encourages and promotes that. Because the more you learn and the closer you get to that, to closing that gap, then the more likely you are to carry on with something. But as you say, that you don't know what you don't know, and sometimes it's the insights that you get from learning in one area, or just the chance discussion with somebody else at work that will give you an idea to create a solution for a problem that you have in your area of work. So I think also that's another factor here to increase the amount of social learning that there is, the informal learning, and the sharing of knowledge across the organisation. These are also ways that are going to help provoke curiosity. So acting on your curiosity, making it easy for people to act on their curiosity, is going to be really helpful to create this learning organisation, which everybody seems to want for the future too.
Okay, thank you for that. We have had some questions about this that I'm hoping Jo and Liz can address. One question is that how does this case for curiosity work when you're looking at very dry subject matters?
I suppose it very much depends on what you consider to be a dry subject, but one person's dry subject might be another person's fascinating one. But that aside, clearly some are not as interesting, maybe compliance training or things that you have to go to. I think just very quick, there's maybe just two things there. One is it depends very much on the learner attitude going into it. You can go in there expecting something to be boring and dry, or you can go in there and say, what can I get out of this? And so ask questions, think about what does this do for me, and actually challenge that with the person that's leading the session. Challenge them to say, what should I be getting out of this? And then have an adult debate about it. So that might be one thing. And I think there's also an onus on teachers and trainers to be more facilitative in learning, to be more to involve their learners more. So that, I think, that's two answers to that question anyway, Sue. So we had a poll earlier where we were looking at where you got your information from, and we also raised this issue of why we have to be more careful now more than ever about what we take to be truth, what we take to be facts, and to be a bit more curious about it, frankly. And I just want to sort of raise one quite interesting article. I found it interesting from the Financial Times earlier this year, which talked about agnotology. And this is the study of willful acts to spread confusion. Now, that might be kind of familiar to people in this day and age where we're seeing things, sadly, in politics, in private sector, and also, well, obviously, one of the best examples of this comes actually from the tobacco industry, where people were clearly making a case to try and debunk the myths there were about the cause of the damaging causes that smoking had on people's health. But I think it's as important today as it was ever, because it uses our own psychology against us, and it's a deliberate way of trying to cause doubt and cast doubt in our minds. And one of the interesting things about the article from the FT, which you can look at, is to understand what the tactics are that are being used by people presenting information at times. So sometimes it's not in a malicious way, but it is usually with some kind of angle. So what they tend to do is they will quote supposed experts or their own experts. They'll refute arguments that have been given by other people. They'll make questions very complicated, and they'll sort of sow seeds of doubts about the facts that other people are making, and they'll undermine the relevance of those facts for us. Then they'll try to make issues old news. This is what they found with the tobacco industry. They trivialize it. They make repetition of the warnings and opposing views out to be a really tedious, boring thing that just doesn't provide anything new to the world. And of course, some facts aren't new. They're just facts. So another tactic that's often used is the tactic of diversion. So there's falsehoods and false claims. And these are the things that sadly tend to stick with the audience more than evidence of the facts. Another tactic is distraction. So we draw attention to the more sort of fallacious accusations or the headline-grabbing topics that remain more memorable than facts. But bringing these things back into learning, I think what's really important about today is to acknowledge that sometimes our psychology works against us. As human beings, we're not necessarily rational in how we think or how we learn. We can be influenced by others deliberately, as it turns out, by our own reluctance to accept even scientific evidence that refutes what we want to believe. So curiosity is something that can help to counter that, because it pulls on us to question things, to look for evidence, to try and support what we're seeing by facts, to explore more, to scratch beneath the surface.
As I said, curiosity helps us question, helps us look at the research, try things, learn from observation, learn from facts, and evaluate. And these are fundamental learning behaviours as well, and behaviours that fuel learning, which then in turn fuel curiosity. Now, once you have that framework for evaluating the quality of information, you're in a better position to make judgments about it and be based on more reliable facts and more reliable sources. Excuse me. You're also able to recognise when your own judgments are compromised by bias, by misunderstanding, and clouds your decision-making. Now, very quick look at curiosity and innovation.
So curiosity and innovation, again, important life skills, but these are the things, curiosity helps us to stop thinking in the normal way of looking at things. We see different patterns, outside our normal ways of thinking and seeing. It helps us if we can think, rather than looking at solving problems, to appreciate what works well and what doesn't work well. Curiosity tends to lead us to find people who know about things that we don't. So we meet different perspectives, we meet different views, and we get different input from them. It helps us to try new things and just to scratch beneath the surface.
Okay, and interestingly, some classic cases from industry are taking curiosity from nature, for example. 3M invented Velcro by looking at how a bumblebee carries pollen. And that was just from a very curious scientist looking at it. We're now going to move on to our final poll, as I know we're out of time.
Okay, so let's just have this final, see if we can just fit this final poll in before we finish. So the question here is, who takes responsibility for your learning in the workplace? So while there are poll results coming in, if you've got any final questions, do put them into the chat box. We can't necessarily answer them now, but we will be trying to get back to you all afterwards. So,
just while we're waiting, we talked a little bit about how you make dry subjects more interesting, and I kind of alluded to that. But I think here are more general tips really about how you can improve learning at work. Rather than thinking that the answers are there to be given from training, I said this earlier, pose more questions rather than giving the answers. So as a learner, ask more questions. As a facilitator, ask more questions. Don't think that you're the sage on the stage. There's nothing more boring than simply treating everybody as if they're starting from the same point. Take some time to find out what people know and start from there rather than from the very beginning. Make use of all the people in the room, all the knowledge to learn from peers. Facilitate a dialogue, so actually make it much more about communicating if possible, and don't be afraid of debate and challenge, because all of these things are stretching all our learning. And then the last point, which is almost one we started with, is just recognise that learning happens in different ways and support as many of these different ways as you can. So time to go back to the poll results, I think. So who is responsible for learning at your work? 52.5% of you saying that you are as an individual. The line manager, 6.6%. L&D professionals, surprisingly, 1.6%. So the combination is about 40%. And actually, that's pretty much as we would expect to see, because there's a role for everyone. So final point on that?
Okay, so we've got some references for you here, and our final challenge to you is to make a list as to what you're curious about and personally curious about, and where that might overlap with your work, your colleagues, or your customers, and how might you then start exploring that curiosity.
thank you, Jo. And I know we are a little bit over time, so I think it's time that we wrapped up now. That brings us to the end of the webinar. Thank you very much, all of you, for attending. But thank you very much for joining us. And I'd also like to extend a very big thank you to our presenters, Jo and Liz. Thank you very much.